Okay, so in part three of this lesson, you're going to be given graphs, and then you're going to be determining some information from those graphs. It's kind of similar to to part two, but this time you're going to be asked to find the domain and range to these functions. So basically, you're going to find domain and range from the graph. All right. So um, for each of the graphs given, this is what you're going to be asked to do. You'll be asked to find the function's domain, the function's range, the x-intercepts. Now, we talked about that in the previous lesson, so that one should be easy. The y-intercept should be easy as well. Remember, the x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. The y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis, and then you'd be asked to find function values like f of something like f of 2, which you did in the previous lesson. So these right here should be the only two new ones in terms of given a graph. How do you find the domain and how do you find the range? Now, you may remember in a previous lesson you did that. Remember we kind of used a ruler to help us determine the domain and range, the domain and range. Okay. All right. So let's look at the first example. But remember, we're doing these parts. All right. So look at the first graph. All right. So part A, this would be number 1. Part A, you want to find the domain. Okay, domain. All right, so remember the domain is a set of x coordinates. It's a set of x coordinates. So here's how you're going to do this. Use your ruler, and domain you go from left to right. Okay, so you go from left to right. Now you got to remember that this arrow keeps on going down like this. Okay, so this is a quadratic function. So the question is how far to the left do we go? Well, ask yourself, is negative 100, when x is negative 100, do I get a point in the graph? Well, remember, it keeps on going like this. All right, so you got to visualize this. You have to visualize these things, that it keeps on going down. See how it keeps on going down? So when x is negative 100, you do get a point in the graph, whatever that y value is. When x is negative 1 million, you're going to get a point in the graph. You have to be able to visualize this. It keeps on going all the way down. So as you go to the left, you're going to get a point in the graph. All right, but remember, when domain, you go from left to right. You go from smallest to largest. Okay. All right. So as I go from left to right, so think of this as negative infinity. Always think of negative infinity for right now, because of this arrow keep on going down like this. Negative infinity. So if I have negative 1 million, I'm going to get a point in the graph. Negative 2 million, I'll get a point in the graph. It'll be way down there, but I get a point in the graph. I get a y value. Okay? So I'm going from negative infinity all the way. Notice I'm touching the graph, keep touching the graph, all the way. So notice I keep touching the graph. So for instance, when x is 9, I get a point in the graph. When x is 10, I get a point in the graph. When x is 100, I get a point in the graph. It's way down there, but I get a point in the graph, and so on. Okay? So from all that, and students do find this idea kind of confusing, but for all that, the domain is going to be from parentheses negative infinity to infinity, meaning that no matter what number I plug in for x, I'm going to get a point in the graph. 100, point in the graph. 1,000, point in the graph. 100 million, point in the graph, and so on. So notice the domain here is listed as an interval because there's an infinite number of an infinite number of x values that's in my domain. Okay, so all these numbers that's on the x-axis, all of them is in my domain. All right, now remember in the previous lesson, your domain was a set of finite numbers, like 3 numbers, 4 numbers. That's because those were ordered pairs. All right, but notice your points. How many points are on this graph? Well, there's an infinite number of points. Okay, so you're going to have infinite number of elements in your domain, an infinite number of elements in your range. Okay. All right, now for the range, notice the arrows are pointing down, so keep going. Remember, the range, you go from bottom up. You go along the y-axis. So I'm going from this point towards, remember your y-axis, you're going towards negative infinity. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way. Now you got to be careful. See, I'm touching the graph. So when y is negative 6, I get a point on the graph. When y is negative 4, I get 2 points on the graph. When y is negative 2, I get 2 points on the graph, and so on. But notice, when y is 2, do I get a point on the graph? The answer is no. See that I'm not touching the graph. The graph stops here. This is where the graph stops. So the graph stops here. So the question is, what is that y value? What is that maximum y value that it stops at? Well, it stops at this y value, which is 1. That's a 1 right here. So this right here, that was 7, 1. So my range, remember, range go from bottom up, So my range is from negative infinity all the way to this maximum y value, which is 1. Now see how that's a closed circle? That 1 is part of my graph. So I'm going to say negative infinity, 1 with a bracket. All right, so that's your domain. So domain is negative infinity to infinity. The range is from negative infinity to, and it stops at the maximum point. The maximum y value is 1. Okay? All right, next one. Oh, well, let's do the X-Intercept. All right, the X-Intercept, where does the graph cross the X-axis? Now, it did not tell you to put these as ordered pair. So in my math lab, it didn't mention anything about ordered pair. If it does say ordered pair, you got to put the X and Y coordinate. But the X-Intercept, and there are 2 of them where the graph crosses the X-axis, will be 6, 8. So you put 6, 8. Don't put that in parentheses. Don't say 6, 8, because 6, 8 is a point. All right, don't say this. So that's wrong. Okay? This is your answer. All right, now the y-intercept, that's not a pretty good one to use for the y-intercept because you don't know where the graph crosses the y-axis, but there is one. You just can't determine it from the graph. All right, so you can't determine that from the graph. All right, now what would be so the next part is the missing function value. So let's say you want to find f of, let's say 5. F of 5. So what's f of 5? Well, remember, f of 5 means what's the y value when x is 5? So I go to x equals 5, and I find this y value. What's this y value right here? Well, the y value is a negative 3. So negative 3. So that's your y value. Okay. The next graph. All right, domain. All right, so again, notice these arrows. There are 2 arrows in both directions. So remember, this keeps on going. So in terms of your domain, remember your domain is a set of x coordinates, your x values. So question is negative 100,000 going, when x is negative 100,000, will that be a point of the graph? And the answer is yes. Okay, so it should be somewhere around here if this is negative 100,000. Negative 1 million, I'm going to get a point of the graph? Yes. Negative 2 million? Yes, and so on. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to, and then you see it keeps on going. You see that? Keeps on going. So keep on going along the x-axis. So when x is 1 billion, I'm going to get a point of the graph? Yes. Be way down there, and so on. So the domain is from negative infinity all the way to infinity. All right, the range, you go from bottom up. So notice the arrows are pointing down, so you're going from negative infinity. So you see when x is negative 5, I get 2 points on the graph. If this was 100, negative 100, I get 2 points on the graph. See how it keeps on going like this? If this was negative 1 million, I get points on the graph. If this was negative 200 million, I get a point on the graph, and so on. So think of it's going down to negative infinity. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to, and then I just got to find what this maximum y value is. Well, that maximum y value is 3. So this maximum y value is 3. So I'm going from negative infinity to 3 with a bracket. Okay, the x-intercept. There's just there are 2 of them. The graph intersects the x-axis at negative 2 and 4. So I say negative 2, 4. Again, don't put that in parentheses. The y-intercept, this time I can see it. There is one. I can figure it out. The y-intercept, that's where the graph crosses the y-axis. So that's at 2. Just put a 2 there. All right, and then they want you to find the missing value. Let's say I want to find f of, let's say, -1. F of -1. So remember, f of -1 means what's the y value when x is -1? And this is your x. So when x is -1, I look at this point right here, that y value is 1. Because remember, this is -1 comma 1. So that y value is 1. You put 1 equal 1. Okay? All right, next one. All right, so again, look at this. We're going through this process again. So keep going through these examples. So see how you have an arrow here, and there's an open circle here. So remember, the open circle means that's where it stopped, but you don't use that number. That number's not part of your graph because it's open. See right here where this is closed? That number right here, that x value and that y value is part of your graph. So this point's not part of your graph. This point is part of your graph. Difference between open and closed. That's an arrow here, so that means it keeps on going. Okay? Keeps on going like this. All right. So, domain. So notice domain, you go from left to right like this. So if this was here, just think of this. If this was -6 billion, am I going to point the graph? Yes, it'll be somewhere around here. If this was -100 billion, am I going to point the graph? Yes. So you're going, now think about the negative infinity idea. So you're going from negative infinity all the way, and remember that's not an arrow, so you don't keep on going. This is where you stop. That's where you stop. So I keep on going and I stop here. So my domain is -infinity to, and then where I stop. Well, this number here is 2. That's where I stop. But I don't use a bracket. I use parentheses because it's an open circle. All right, so you got to use your x. So don't say -2 because remember your domain of your x coordinates. So what's this x coordinate right here? That x coordinate is 2. So that's where you stop when x is 2. Parentheses because this is open. So don't say -infinity because there's no arrow. Remember, it's not going further. This is where it stopped. All right, so there's your domain. The range, okay, range, you go from bottom up now. Okay, so where do you start? Remember, this is not an arrow, so don't say -infinity like you did before. See, here you had arrows on both ends. Here you had arrows on both ends. Here you don't. So you got to think like that. So use your ruler, and then this is where you start. When you went along the y-axis, that's where you start. Question is, what's that y-coordinate? So now you're thinking y-coordinate now. That y-coordinate is -2. It's an open circle, so you're going to say parentheses -2, comma, and then you keep on going. And see that arrow? Keeps on going. So keeps on going. You see, you keep on going, right? So if this was -6 billion, I get a point in the graph. If this was -200 billion, I get a point in the graph. But now it's going towards what concept? It's going to positive infinity. So -2, positive infinity with parentheses. So remember, -infinity, positive infinity, you always use parentheses. Okay? All right, the x-intercept. Where does the graph cross the x-intercept? Well, across the x-axis. Where does the graph cross the x-axis? It crosses the x-axis here, and that's 0. The y-intercept is at the same place. See, that's the origin, so you're going to say 0 as well. All right, let's suppose you want to find f of, let's say, -3. F of -3. So f of -3 means what's the y value when x is -3? So when x is -3, here's the y value right here, so that is 3. So f of -3 equals 3. Okay, let's look at the next one. So again, domain. All right, now notice this time, this is open, this is closed. There are no arrows, so since there's no arrows, you're not going to have infinity or -infinity since there's no arrows. Okay? No infinity, -infinity. No infinity, -infinity since there aren't any arrows. Okay, so for the domain, you go from left to right. So the question is -5 going to be in the domain? No, because when x is -5, there's no point of the graph. Same thing here. I start touching the graph when I get to this x coordinate here. What's that x coordinate? That x coordinate's -2. See, a -2 x coordinate, go along the x-axis. But it's open, so I'm going to say parentheses -2. And then I keep on going, See how I'm touching parts of the graph? See how I'm going on part of the graph? And then I'm going all the way to, and then I stop at 2. And then at 2, when x is 2, So remember, domain, your x coordinates. At x is 2, it's close here, so I'm going to use a bracket. So that's your domain. So you're going from, so -2, when x is -2, that's not a point on the graph, but I got to start there. So from -2 all the way to a +2. And a bracket at +2 because it's a closed circle. The range, okay, you're going from bottom, you're going along the y-axis from smaller to larger. So the range, notice y equal -4 is not on the graph because it's not touching, there's no point on the graph in which y is -4. Okay, so I start touching the graph though when y is -2. But that's that's an open circle, so it's going to be a parentheses. And I keep on going. Notice I'm getting y values on the graph, y value, y value, y value, y value, y value, all the way to this point, and that's where I stop because it's a closed circle. There's no arrow, but that y value is 6. So it's -2 to 6 with the bracket. Bracket because that's a closed circle. All right, now the x-intercepts and y-intercepts are easy. X-intercept, that's where the graph crosses the x-axis. It crosses the x-axis at -1. The y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. It crosses the y-axis at when y is 2. And then let's say you want to find f of, let's say, 1. So f of 1. So what's the y value when x is 1? When x is 1, my y value is 4. So remember this right here is 1, 4. So you say equal 4. All right, next one. Suppose, all right, let's look at this one. Kind of move this all the way. All right. Okay, so let's find the domain. All right, see an arrow again. This is a closed circle. So we go from left to right along the x-axis of the domain. So remember, this is keep on going, right? So if this was set -5, I'm going to get a point of the graph. It'll be, see how it does this? It does this. See, it keeps on going. So at -5, I'm going to get a point of the graph. At -6, I'm going to get a point of the graph. So this was -5 billion, I'm going to get a point of the graph, and so on. So I'm going from, in this case, keep on going. So I'm going from -infinity, so I'm getting a point of the graph somewhere. -infinity, and then all the way to, and then it stops here. There's no arrow, that's where it stops. So I'm going from -infinity to this x-coordinate, which is 0. That x-coordinate here is 0 with a parentheses because it's open. Okay? Now the range. The range, you're going from, you go along the y-axis from bottom up. So I start touching the graph when at this y value here. Okay, so that's an open circle, but that y value is 0, because remember that's the origin. So the origin, remember, is 0, 0. So the y value is 0, and I keep on going all the way to +infinity because remember it keeps on going up. So when y is, if this was -4 million, get a point in the graph. If this was -4 billion, I get a point in the graph. If this was -400 billion, I get a point in the graph, and so on. So going towards +infinity with parentheses. All right, now the x-intercept, this is a little bit tricky, and the y-intercept. Okay, so be a little bit careful. Remember, the x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. Well, you may say it does cross the x-axis here, it touches it here, but remember that's an open circle. So since it's open, there is no x-intercept. There isn't any. It's open. It's not part of the graph. So no x-intercept. So remember, this right here, not part of the graph. All right? And the y-intercept as well. You may say, well, that's where the graph crosses the y-axis. Well, yeah, that's an open circle, though. So you can't use that point. So 0, 0 is not part of the graph. It's an open circle. So no y-intercept. Okay, so none for either of those. No, there are no x-intercept and no y-intercept. All right, let's suppose you want to find f of, let's say, -2. So what's the y value when x is -2? Well, when x is -2, you go and you find the point. Here's a point here. So when x is -2, that y value is 4. And so that's what you put in the blank, 4. All right, over here, the domain. All right, so again, you go from left to right. So I start touching the graph. Remember, there's only one arrow here. There's no arrow here. So I'm going to have infinity in my answer for part of it. So notice that I start touching the graph here when x is, see, that's x negative 1, that's x 0. So when x is 0, and it's a closed circle, so I'm going to put bracket all the way to, and we see this arrow, so this was 6 million, I get a point on the graph. If this was 6 billion, I get a point on the graph. 6 trillion, I get a point on the graph. So I'm going all the way to infinity. Going all the way to infinity with parentheses. The range, you go from bottom up as well. So I'm going from, so when y is negative 1, I don't get a point on the graph. I start touching the graph when y is 0. That's the origin, 0. But since it's a closed circle, I'm put bracket all the way to, and I keep on going. So if this was, he keeps on doing this. So if this was 4, at 4, I get a point on the graph. See this point right here? So I get a y value. If this was 4 million, I get a point on the graph. If this was 4 billion, I get a point on the graph, and so on. So it's going all the way to infinity, I'm getting a point on the graph. Okay, so it's all the way to infinity. All right, let's look at this one. All right, so let's find the domain. Oops, I didn't finish this. Okay, X-Intercept, let's do the X-Intercept. X-Intercept, now you see how the graph touches the x-axis here? So that's an X-Intercept. It's closed. So I'm going to say the X-Intercept occurs when x is 0. The Y-Intercept occurs when y is 0. All right, so here I didn't have any. See the difference? That's open, that's closed. So 0, 0. Because remember, that's the origin. So the X-Intercept's at 0, the Y-Intercept's at 0. Okay, let's find f of, let's say, 4. F of 4. So when x is 4, what's the y value? Well, that y value here is 2. So we say equal 2. All right? Okay, now this one. So domain. All right, so domain, you go along the x-axis. So notice I start touching the graph when I get here. So that's the x-coordinate negative 2, but it's an open circle. So I got to put parentheses, comma, all the way to, and then notice the arrow keeps on going. So it's going to infinity with parentheses. The range. All right, so the range, you go from bottom up now. So I start touching the graph when I get here. See the arrow, so you go along the ruler. So you go along the y-axis. So that y-coordinate is negative 2. So remember this is the point negative 2, negative 2. So the y-coordinate is negative 2. So I'm going from negative 2, since it's open circle, use parentheses, all the way to, remember it keeps on going up like this, all the way to infinity with an arrow. All right, so remember, you have an arrow, you're going to have infinity involved or negative infinity involved. Okay, the X-Intercept is here. That occurs when x is 2. The Y-Intercept, we're going to have to estimate this. Let's say, I'm making a guess here, let's say that's approximately equal to negative 1/2. Okay, so the graph crosses the x-axis at negative 1/2. I estimated that. All right, and then let's find f of, let's say, negative 1. So f of negative 1, so when x is negative 1, what's that y value? Well, that y value is negative 1. All right, let's look at this one. So notice you have 2 arrows involved, okay? There are 2 arrows, but you got to be careful. You have to be careful. Domain's going to be easy for you. The domain's going to be the easy one. Because why? Well, watch. All right, so domain, you go from left to right, like this. So if this was going towards in negative infinity, so let's say negative 6 million, am I going to get a point on the graph? Yes. Get a point on the graph somewhere around here. If this was negative 6 billion, I get a point on the graph. Negative 600 billion, I get a point on the graph. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to, and then notice I'm going to infinity. 6 billion, 600 billion, 6 trillion, and so on. So negative infinity. So this is negative infinity to infinity. All right, now the range. So the range, remember, you just remove your ruler and go bottom up now. So notice the arrow's not pointing down, so you got to be careful. It's pointing to the right, like horizontally, I should say, horizontally. So notice I start touching the graph at what? I start touching the graph at what y value? I start touching the graph at 1. Okay, this is where it is. So you have a bunch of 1s here, an infinite number of 1s. But I start touching the graph at 1. Okay, so these are all, there's no open circles here, so I'm going to say bracket 1, all the way to, all right, let's look at the y value 6. So at 6, I get a point on the graph. If this was 6 billion, I get a point on the graph. 6 trillion, I get a point on the graph. So I'm going all the way to infinity. See the arrow? So you just keep on moving, doesn't stop. Okay, with a parentheses. So notice the difference between domain and range here. All right, X-Intercept. Where does the graph cross the x-axis? Well, the graph does not cross the x-axis, so you're going to say none. It does not cross the x-axis. The Y-Intercept. Where does the graph cross the y-axis? It crosses the y-axis here. What's that y value? The y value is 2. All right, and let's say you want to find f of 3. So f of 3, so what's the y value when x is 3? Well, when x is 3, what's this y value right here? That y value is 1. Let's say you want to find f of 300. Well, remember, 300 is way out here. Keeps on going. See, that's horizontal. So all these y values are 1s. So when x is 300, I'm also going to get a 1. What if you want to find f of, let's say, negative 2? So f of negative 2 means what's the y value when x is negative 2? Well, here's negative 2. What's this y value? That y value is 4. See, this right here is negative 2, 4. So you say equal 4. Okay? All right. Now let's do let's do a few more. Okay. So notice there are no arrows here, so no infinity or negative infinity. There is an arrow here, so you will have either infinity or negative infinity. In this case, infinity. All right, domain. You go from along the x-axis. So I start touching the graph here at this open circle, and the x-coordinate here is 0. So 0 with parentheses because it's an open circle, and I stop here, and I got to figure out this x-coordinate here. So we're going to estimate what this is. So let's say that is 3.5 with a bracket because of the open circle, closed circle. I estimated that. All right. So that's where it stopped. Okay, the range, go from bottom up. All right, so I'm going from, I start touching the graph at this y value. It's open, so I'm going to say parentheses negative 3, because that's the y value, all the way to, and I stop here, and that y value is 3, with a bracket, because it's a closed circle. Okay, so open circle, parentheses, closed circle, this y value is 3. So that's a bracket. X-intercept. So where does the graph cross the x-axis? We're going to estimate that again. So let's just say 2.5. All right, I estimated. So this is estimate. All right, now let me ask you about the y-intercept. Where does the graph cross the y-axis or touch the y-axis? Well, that's where it touches the y-axis, but it's an open circle. So you're going to say none. There is no y-intercept because of the open circle. And then let's say you want to find f of 2. So f of 2, when x is 2, what's the y value? Well, the y value is this y value here, which is negative 1. All right. Over here, the domain. Okay, go along the x-axis. So you're going from, you start touching the graph. When you go along the right of the x-axis, you start touching the graph here. That's not an arrow, so don't say negative infinity. So you touch the graph here, it's a closed circle, so you're going to say bracket negative 2, comma, all the way to, and it keeps on going because of the arrow. Keeps on going, so you're going to say infinity with parentheses. The range, all right, the range, again, you're going from bottom up, so that's a bracket at negative 2. So that's where you start. That y value is negative 2, comma, all the way to, and just keeps on going up, and just keeps on going like this. So keep going all the way to positive infinity. The X-intercept it looks like it intersects the x-axis at 1. The y-intercept, I'm going to estimate that. So it looks like here, so that's negative 0.5. All right, and let's say you want to find f of 4. So that means what's the y value in x is 4? Well, the y value is 1. All right, and let's do this last one. Okay, domain. So again, you go from left to right. So when I start touching the graph, and there's no arrows here, no arrows, so you're not going to see any infinity, negative infinity, none, no infinity, negative infinity. So I start touching the graph when x is negative 4 with the bracket, all the way to, and I stop here when x is 2, but this is an open circle, so it'll be parentheses. Range. All right, range, I go from bottom up. So when I go from bottom up, I start touching the graph. I start touching the graph here. That y value is negative 2. Closed circle, so we use bracket. All the way to, yeah, I stop here because there's no arrow. That's where I stop. Since it's an open circle, I can't use it. But that y value is 4, so it would be parentheses. The x-intercept, looks like the graph crosses the x-axis at negative 2. Y-intercept, looks like the graph crosses the y-axis at 2. And let's say you want to find f of, let's say, 1. So f of 1 is, so when x is 1, what's that y value? The y value is 3. Okay. All right, so there's quite a bit of stuff here. Finding the domain and range from a graph is not very easy for students. So you really need to practice on this. Go back over this video, look at the keys in the worksheets, and so on. Okay?